Thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you so much for having me here today and having me be part of this work and share the research that we've been doing at the Education and Employment Research Center. Just thrilled to have another chance to talk about some of this work and hopefully it's helpful in sparking some conversations and for everybody here in terms of thinking about the work that you all are doing. I know you're actively thinking a lot about these questions and issues around non-credit and workforce and so. I want to, spend some time. I think, as Brittany said, I was, thrilled to have the chance to do the keynote at the conference earlier this year. I We'll probably go through some similar information. I'm going to try not to be super repetitive, but I know that not everybody who's here today was able to be at the conference. And so I wanted to just give a chance to kind of share some of the broad background. And I do have some new things that I've added in here since that time that I'll look forward to sharing with you all. And also hopefully really looking forward to the discussion today and hearing from all of you. So I think probably it's not news to anybody here, but non-credit education is becoming increasingly more relevant, more interest in it. Individuals are expressing more interest in finding quicker pathways to get to the workforce. States around the country are investing more money in programs that fund non-credit education. And we don't have a lot of data, and I'll talk about that, but we do have some estimates that tell us that close to 4 million students are enrolled in non-credit. So there's a lot of students that are being touched by these programs. But given the sort of lack of data and the sort of lack of traditional focus on understanding non-credit, we have a lot of questions. Foundationally, one of the questions I'm always asking is, what is non-credit? What is it even that we're talking about? So it's just sort of some definitional questions and issues. And then, what are some trends in non-credit education? How do colleges promote quality? Everybody, is concerned about quality. What does that mean? How do we promote it? And then, of course, we want to understand the students, right? What are their experiences and what are their outcomes? And then, where do we need to go in terms of data and research and greater understanding? So these are some of the questions I'm going to talk about today. Hopefully that will be helpful. Let me see. So what is non-credit? As we talk about it, there are many different forms of non-credit, actually. Sometimes I think we maybe jump to just think about one element of non-credit. Oftentimes these days, people are thinking a lot about workforce education, and that is a really very important part of non-credit. There's occupational training. There's also different types of that. We also know that there's contract training, where employers are directly coming to colleges for workforce training, and that's slightly different in terms of its content and nature. But in addition to workforce, we know that many colleges have had a history of providing recreational, personal interest, avocational programs as part of non-credit. We don't want to lose sight that that's for some colleges is a very important part of that mission, as well as the basic skills or pre-college remediation role for non-credit. So, which is all to say that there's a lot of different kinds of things going on in non-credit, and we should recognize that diversity. And when we think about expected outcomes and such, it's important to recognize those different types. And the other piece to recognize here is often in these conversations about sort of shorter, faster ways to get people ready for the workforce, we talk about non-credit education, but there's also a lot of talk these days about non-degree credentials. And what exactly are non-degree credentials? I'm going to unpack that a little bit too, just to make that clear, because I think that sometimes gets a little bit confused and these terms get mixed up. And so we think about non-degree credentials as including certificates, which can be credit or non-credit, badges, micro-credentials, certifications, licenses. I'll talk a little bit more about each of those in a bit. But I wanted to get to that question of the types of non-credit programs and just give you some sense of kind of the national context. We've had a project where we've been working with states to document their non-credit offerings, and across the states that we've partnered with, you can see from this figure here the mix of programs that are offered. The blue portion of the figure is the occupational and vocational, and the green is sponsored contract training. So you can see in most of these states, the vocational workforce training is the majority of the non-credit programs offered by colleges. One exception is Oregon has a good deal of pre-college and personal interest. Maryland also has a good amount of pre-college as well. And I think that that varies state by state. So you will see that if we were to do this across the country, I think you would see a good amount of variation. So that also tells you the context matters quite a bit in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about non-credit. But overall, we do see a lot in the workforce realm. So now to this question of credentials. I want to share one report that I think is really important, one idea and one sort of conceptualization about credentials based on a report that Chris Mullen did, a kind of a review of literature and kind of historical perspective on credentials and how we think about them. And, he has a few different categories, very broad categories for credentials that he lays out in his paper. Credential at a very high level, is something that helps to validate or confirm someone's learning, achievement, knowledge, preparation for performing certain tasks. So that's a very broad definition. When we break that down, we see that there are macro credentials, which tend to mark a person's knowledge at a very broad level, that they know a broad set of skills across a broader field of study. It's something that takes years to master. So it's kind of like you almost know, what everything there you need to know about a particular occupation. It's a very broad and comprehensive set of skills. Now, a micro-credential, on the other hand, is something that's smaller, I guess, as the name implies, right? It's much more specific, a much more specific set of learning outcomes. It tends to be more narrow, and can be achieved in a shorter period of time. So it's a very specific skill set. So it's not the kind of skill set that's going to let you fully enter into an occupation, but it's going to show that you know one particular thing, like maybe you know Excel really well, or project management or something. So it's a very small and narrow skill, very still quite valuable. But so these are the kinds of the credentials mark these different kinds of skills. Now, the other credential that Chris mentions in this paper is the maintenance credential, and that recognizes a whole other set of programs that are about maintaining professional currency within a field. Once you're already in a field, it's the kind of professional development piece of non-credit and of credentialing that there's a lot of it going on. I think a lot of times we're really focused on programs that help people enter into occupations, but it's important to recognize that there's a lot going on around that sort of maintenance and helping people to progress professionally. So I offer these categories just to help think about the different kinds of credentials and non-credit programs that they're attached to, and help us think about what those are more clearly. If we do that, then we can think more clearly about what some of the expected outcomes might be, which we'll get to in a little bit. So now I want to unpack just the different kinds of credentials, the different kinds of credentials we're talking about here. Broadly, I mentioned degrees, kind of the macro credentials. Those are tied with credit-bearing programs. Certificates. Now, here's the thing: is that we have certificates, certifications, and licenses. Those are commonly talked about in the non-degree credential realm. They can all be sort of attached to a non-credit program. Certificate is awarded by a non-credit program. Certifications are a program can prepare someone to attain a certification or a license, but are awarded by different entities. And that's one of the things we try and map out here, is just who is awarding what kind of organizations are awarding what kinds of credentials. And you can see that, certificates are probably the area where there's probably the most confusion in the field currently, in that lots of different kinds of organizations offer certificates, and many of them both award the certificate and provide the instruction related to attaining it. Whereas with certifications and licenses, there's only certain organizations that can award those, but many kinds of organizations that provide the instruction. This is important when we think about quality and how to promote quality and ensure quality. It sort of helps us think about who actually has the power to think about quality and to influence it. So those are some of the things that we sort of try and lay out here. The other thing that is important to recognize, again, I'm trying to sort of map out all the different kinds of non-credit programs, is to note that, again, as I said, some of these are for entering into an occupation. Some of them are related to getting a more targeted set of skills. Some of these many of these occur at the sub-baccalaureate level, but some of them are also for occupations that require a bachelor's degree and beyond. And oftentimes we're very interested in those that are um, helping people at the sub-baccalaureate level. So just to recognize there's a lot of other things that go on beyond that. But also even within the sub-baccalaureate level, there's a difficult question of the kinds of labor market outcomes that can be expected from those occupations. At that level, there is that sort of set of jobs that are well paying that non-credit programs can lead to. And I think we're all probably aware that there are low paying jobs that maybe have some pathways to better jobs. And then there are just some low paying jobs that do not. And so this also highlights the challenge of outcomes measurement here. When you have a program that is tied to an occupation that doesn't lead to a well-paying job, what does that mean about the program? We'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of quality, but some of this here is just to recognize that there are different kinds of jobs in the labor market, and the labor market structure is as it is in terms of the pay. And so we have to be kind of particular and specific about what we're talking about in terms of the occupations that we're preparing people for. I'm going to briefly talk about some trends in non-credit education. So that's kind of the definitional piece. I hope that isn't too much. There's a lot of different nuance there, but I think that it's important to try and be clear about what we're talking about, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges I do think in non-credit is just not having clear definitions of what we're talking about and what the goals of different programs are. So the more consistency that we can come up with in language and thinking about that, I think the better served programs will be in terms of communicating to students what the expected outcomes are and communicating to a policy community what expectations should be as well. So some of the trends, we did a research study a couple years ago looking at just a kind of a national landscape of non-credit education. We talked to folks at community colleges across 22 states, trying to look at the organizational structure of their non-credit programs, the students that they were targeting, the focus of their non-credit programs, a variety of elements. Throughout, you'll see I have a variety of QR codes if you're interested in looking at any of these research papers in more detail. I'll invite you to do that. I will just try and provide some of the highlights of them and invite you to take a look at them later. But this sort of trend paper, we noticed a few things. One of the really important things that we saw, and I imagine many of you are doing this, is labor market analysis, is sort of thinking about how to make sure that these programs are really targeted to the needs of the labor market. And we were asking sort of like, how for the programs, how are you thinking about quality? And that was one of the things is that they were saying, we're really trying to tie to the labor market. The other thing that they often said was, we're also really relying on these sort of external measures of skills. And so industry certificates or other kinds of external standards that come from industry. So that's the key thing about the certifications rather, correct that language, but the industry certifications are awarded by industry bodies, and those often can provide a standard. Another way programs talked about quality was inviting faculty from the credit side to be involved in program development. So that was another trend. In states where there was funding, in some cases there were approval processes that might help promote quality. And I think one of the challenges, of course, is trying to understand, student demand and the fact that there is demand, probably in some cases schools interpret it as a positive sign, but with the lack of data, it is hard to know how that actually translates into earnings outcomes. We did see a notable shift, I think, across many of the schools to prioritize workforce oriented programs over what we'd say is like a more comprehensive approach to non-credit, which might include more of the sort of a vocational, recreational, as well as basic skills. And so whereas, schools might have had sort of a mix of different non-credit programs, we saw colleges really, in some cases, very intentionally saying, we are choosing to prioritize workforce because it is what the community really needs. It's where our mission should really be. And so they were really emphasizing that. In addition, we definitely saw in some cases where, colleges were saying we really also need to target students who are in need and figure out populations that could really benefit from non-credit programs. So kind of looking into the community of where students were underserved, where they weren't being served by the college, and trying to figure out how to take these programs out to those students. We did see across schools shifts in organizational location, and it could go about both ways, kind of bringing non-credit together, pulling it apart, non-credit and credit. Um, we definitely saw also an increased reliance on partnerships. And so one of the things was, bringing in external vendors in some cases to help increase capacity and variety of programs. So even programs like Ed2Go, for example, some of the schools talked about partnering and, in that case, being able to offer a greater range of programs. And so the partnerships were very important. And, for colleges, that's really important just to think about how do you know whether a partnership is valuable, whether you want to partner with an external group. One thing to mention is that there are many sort of quality assurance efforts involved. One of them is called the Credentials Lab through the Higher Learning Commission, and that's definitely an effort that is sort of would help colleges and other institutions determine where partnerships would be most valuable by providing some kind of quality metrics and assurances on these kinds of providers. So that's one trend that we definitely saw. So I think, the structure for non-credit is really interesting in that so much has been, we need to sort of ask the question of, why offer non-credit to begin with even, right? And we think a lot of we hear a lot about just the speed and flexibility and tying to the local labor market needs. And I think that's a question worth thinking long and hard about is why offer a program in non-credit? I mean, I think, there's certain things about non-credit that make it different and valuable, and that is, the speed for getting a program up and running, the flexibility in terms of instructors that can teach, the timing and such. But it is a question to think about. Could some non-credit programs be transitioned into credit programs? Should some of them be run in credit? Those are open questions, and because it's really important for thinking about pathways to credit, and that's the big question a lot of folks are thinking about is how to make those pathways and how to help students move along those pathways. And there's quite a bit of variation there in terms of what we see. One of the challenges there, I would say, we saw was just not a lot of supports for students to move along those pathways, and that's tricky. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how colleges promote quality, and then I'm going to stop for a bit for us to have some discussion here. But I want to just talk a little bit about what we think about quality. What exactly does quality mean? I alluded to some ideas about quality in that last segment here, but overall, when we think about quality, one of the ideas we have, and this is laid out in one of our papers at the center, is thinking about credential quality or program quality. We think about the design of the credential or the program overall. So what are some of the decisions that you make in terms of how you structure it? What's the content? What's the mode of delivery? How accessible is it? How transparent is information about it? So these are all sort of decisions that go into creating the program. But then if you really want to know, gosh, did you achieve your goals? Do the credential holders, the learners who come out of the program have the relevant competencies that that program intends to convey or the credential intends to mark? So what are the competencies? That's one that's often hard to measure. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if folks have ways of doing that well in programs, and probably assessment varies, but how do you make that real clear? Like, what are the competencies that learners are taking away? The category of quality probably that people are most often referring to are sort of outcomes of value, right? Our learners or credential holders earning good wages after completing the program or attaining the credential? Are they able to advance in employment? Are they able to continue on in education? We may also, if we were to expand that category too, we might also care about looking at employer outcomes. Are they getting more skilled workers? Are they able to find them more easily? And then there are community benefits and economic development benefits. Are regions thriving more because there are more skilled workers? So there's many different ways we can look at outcomes of value. And so I do encourage everyone to try and think broadly about those, even though, we definitely do need to prioritize certain ones. I think certainly getting to labor market outcomes of participants are important, but to the extent we can think clearly about what some of those other outcomes are, I think that's, a value in this conversation, especially with so many different kinds of programs that could lead to different kinds of outcomes depending on the program goal. Um, One of the things I just want to highlight here in this slide is this idea of market processes, that there are different things different mechanisms, different strategies that would take a high quality credential and translate it into an outcome of value. And so this is really sort of that process of like, how does a credential or a program become known? How does it become used? And so there are some active things that have to happen here. There's, either, whether it's by reputation or by interaction or by information, programs and credentials need to be translated into the labor market. And so there's a sort of market here for things that help a credential to be known. At the same time, there's also the labor market, and the labor market functions as it does. And I mentioned earlier just the challenge of having some occupations that are low paid, that are undervalued. And so there also is this recognition that, you might have a really high quality credential that does not lead to an outcome of value because of the labor market, because of structures in the labor market that maybe don't necessarily reflect anything about the quality of the credential, but have to do with the labor market. And so it's important to recognize that. And that's a complicated policy discussion about, what do you do in that case? But at least recognize, that it may not necessarily be about the quality of the program or the credential per se. So I want to share briefly about another project that we did building off of that landscape scan that I mentioned. And in this case, we looked at non-credit programs in 4 different colleges. Harper College in Illinois was one of them. We were thrilled to be able to take a look at these programs, the program level within these colleges. And so Harper was one of our partners, LaGuardia Community College, Mount San Antonio College in California, and Northern Virginia Community College. And we tried to get a real variety of programs in terms of different fields of study, different kinds of non-degree credentials that they were awarding. And, so that we've got, some that are business oriented, some that are more science oriented, some that are more health oriented, IT. So a real range here. And we tried to take a look at these elements of credential quality, how relevant to the labor market are the programs, how stackable are they, what are the instructional processes, how are they assessed? And I'll go through each of these with just some high level findings here. Clearly, one of the things I mentioned is that the context is very important. The state funding mechanisms changed quite a bit in terms of what the colleges could do and how they structured their programs, as well as the sort of the college themselves in terms of where they placed those programs and in the divisions within the college. So I just want to share with you a little bit more about some of the key findings around the programs and around quality. So one of them is really, like I said, I think some of the things we saw in our national scan, the landscape scan, about key markers of quality really was this, again, the sort of local and regional labor market engagement. So I think we saw that take place in a couple of different ways. So with LaGuardia Community College, for example, they had a medical billing program. And as part of that program, they worked very closely with local hospitals and local employers in their area to build the program, to construct the program. They, in that case, decided not to use a national certification, but to really work with their local employers and build something that the employers would want to hire people right out of that program. So that's a way to really locally engage. Virginia's Fast Forward program, offered a different strategy in this of ensuring labor market alignment. And in that case, for a program to be part of Fast Forward, and Fast Forward is a performance-based funding program for non-credit workforce training programs in Virginia. And for a college to have a program listed as part of Fast Forward, they would have to document the labor market need. And at the regional level, and really, do labor market scans, look at labor market information, really assess the need and document that before that program could be approved. So in that case, they were probably looking at a slightly higher level of a larger level of geography than, working with their immediate service area. But those are some examples of just ways to approach the alignment. So now I think, another piece here, that's interesting and notable. I think, again, one of the things that we were looking at in this project is sort of like what are some of the unique features of non-credit here, in a way that make it distinctive, and that the colleges themselves would say, like, these are features that we say, we think make our programs quality. Um, so really focusing on that sort of first level piece of I was talking about around the design of the credential. We want to get to the outcomes eventually. That is going to be some of the next steps. And I do have some preliminary findings later to share with you from the field on that. But so I just want to talk a little bit about, some of the distinctive features of non-credit and the curriculum and instruction, and sort of like balancing the need to prepare students for certification tests or licensure tests, things like that. To build that in, and many of the programs did intentionally build that in as part of their programs. Um, as well as also sort of helping the students to get, real experience in the field. I think that was, one of the things that we saw that was very interesting was, the instructors too bringing in their work experience into the classroom. We saw that quite a bit. One example was with Harper's real estate program, sort of having folks who worked in the industry and could bring in other speakers and really kind of made those experiences very real for the folks in that program. Now, I think, one of the things that's really challenging that we did see, and that varied based on the funding, was program were services and such and resources that help to make the programs more accessible, whether it be more advising, other kinds of supports for students. And that was something that, both Mount San Antonio and Nova had some resources from the state to help do that. And that was one of the things we noted there. Articulation from non-credit to credit is a very big topic, and something that I'll come back to later. And we saw different ways of doing that, and one very interesting way to sort of promote those connections was through mirrored courses. And that was something we saw both at Mount San Antonio and at Harper College, which is, a course that someone can register for both. It could be either taken as credit or non-credit. So that sort of makes a little bit more fluidity between the two. Really, the instruction is the same, and there may be different assessments and requirements, but, you kind of make a greater equivalency there in the courses. And so, that's one thing. The other strategy there is just articulation and having agreements between non-credit and credit-bearing programs, where if a student were to complete the non-credit programs, such as in LaGuardia's medical billing and coding program, they could then transfer into to an associate degree program at the college. And that's tricky because field by field that varies, and the requirements there, certain accreditation standards and things like that certainly make that a challenge. So it seems to happen more on a program by program basis that we saw. One of the other things that I think is super important underlying a lot of this here is just the importance of partnerships. And so I think you see that, I was talking about the sort of labor market alignment and outreach to employers, and local employers and regional employers. I think that's one of the things that we saw. Sometimes grants prioritize those close relationships with employers. Again, with LaGuardia's, we saw the medical billing program do that. We also saw that with their community health worker program, where that program was designed from the ground up from local employers based on the needs that they had, really very customized to sort of how that community health worker profession was emerging and evolving, in their city at that time. And so I think that's, one of those things that non-credit programs can do very well is to be very adaptive to immediate needs, and align curriculum with what's happening. We saw that, in Mount San Antonio's EMT program, for example. They worked very, very closely with specific local employers, local ambulance companies to craft that program, and also to offer students work-based learning experiences as well. And that was an important element for that program, certainly for students to get some real hands-on experience in that field. And so I think, there's a lot of different ways that this can all happen. One of the things that was interesting, as I mentioned again, is sort of the balancing the need to align with local employers as well as the national standards. And so I think we saw, a bit of a balance between those two, and sometimes having to prioritize one over the other. But I think that some strategies that really emerged from that research was just the importance as of looking at the actual employer relationship as a key element in a grant. That the relationship itself is has a good amount of value, and that's can be considered a key element or outcome. Um, you know, Definitely relying on the relationships that instructors have with employers was definitely, another key takeaway. And sometimes in some cases, instructors, were employers as well. We're working in the field, but sort of, not underestimating the value of drawing on the experience of the instructors and really using that to enhance and enrich the program and student experience. Um, the other piece that was super important is, getting that employer input throughout the design process. As I mentioned with some of these, they were very closely designed based on the employer needs. And so part of that is a very iterative process, asking for feedback and whatnot, and looking at and reflecting and trying to improve over time. So I think those are some important things that we learned from the schools we worked with. We're still, continuing on that research. I want to stop now. I have some questions and thoughts for discussion, but I also just want to open up to hear from folks that are here. If you have questions or thoughts or comments that you'd like to share, and just I'd love to hear from your experience too. If there's no particular questions for me, I'd love to just maybe take a moment and hear from folks if anyone has something they'd like to share on any of these questions or anything that I've shared.
And so you all can feel free to type things into the chat, or if you have a working microphone and want to come off mute, you're able to do that as well.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for this presentation. It was so very helpful. Um, I'm over at the College of Lake County, just neighbors from Harper, so it was great to see their work represented here. I'm curious, to your mind, with the work that you're doing, we're struggling to find the kind of professional organizations or groups that are having these kinds of regular conversations. And I'm curious if you can help point us towards more opportunities like this to learn about the landscape and where we can lean on to do great work.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that. I think there's probably many groups. One I will say that's near and dear to my heart that I know a lot about is the National Council on Workforce Education. I've been involved with their conferences for a number of years. They have one coming up in October in Norfolk. And these are the exact kinds of things that get talked about at their annual meeting. And I know there's a lot of new things that are under development with NCWE that I think will foster even more opportunities for this kind of discussion. So I definitely would encourage anyone on this, call today to take a look at the NCWE, and I can also share some information to be distributed later. Because I think it's a very good community of really thoughtful people who are asking all these same questions and sharing practice. So I would recommend that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have a practice to share that, I've shared some things that we saw in other schools. That anyone have something that they've done or they've seen that's interesting that might be interesting to share?
This is Levon Nelson at the Illinois Community College Board, and thank you, Michelle. But I just wanted to let you know, well, two things. One, for those of you, all of you that have the non-credit grant, which is just about every community college, you can use that for travel for meaningful experiences like the NCWE certainly would count under the grant as appropriate. But then I also wanted to point out we made non-credit to credit programs, program opportunities a part of the non-credit grant. And the colleges have just finished their first year in March of this grant. And we have asked for their input on how they're moving, what they're doing in that space, non-credit to credit. And we're getting some very interesting results and information. It's not, we weren't asking for data per se, but more for what direction are they going, what areas are they working in specific, and so we're getting some good responses on that as they submit their final report for this first year. So this is a new opportunity that we have through the state. It's state funding for our community colleges for non-credit, and non-credit in Illinois is primarily, the things you went over, community, continuing professional development, customized training, contract training. And then, of course, there's a youth component, which isn't covered in the grant, but there is a youth component too that's non-credit. Did I miss anybody? As far as what we consider non-credit? Awfully quiet out there. So I just wanted to point those things out, but
That's great. It sounds, I mean, it sounds like the resources that you have are so rich in Illinois right now in this area. I'm really excited to see what comes out, what comes out of
sure.
that, what lessons you learn from all the work you're doing with the grants. It's really
And we
exciting.
are doing a final report for this year one to summarize. And actually, Brittany will be helping on that. So they're going to be pulling things together for us. So
Good. I hope I get to see it. That'd be
yeah,
great to learn.
we'll remember that.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. All right, well, I'll just shift into sharing some other research that we've been doing on the outcomes, right? That's what everybody always wants to get to is outcomes. What are the outcomes of non-credit education? And I said, there's not a lot of data, but there is some data. It's beginning to become more clear. It's, emerging data. So we took a look at sort of the set of research studies that have been out. We identified around 15 that were out in the past 5 years that come from a variety of different sources, national surveys, administrative data, with a variety of different methods. So it was, I will say from a research standpoint, it was a little tricky to kind of make some comparisons and draw some conclusions. But at a very high level, we did that. We took a look at these studies and we tried to synthesize what do we know? What do we know about the field right now? And this is both non-credit and non-degree credentials. So one big takeaway that we can see from the literature is that very few students transition to credit pathways. So I know there's a lot of effort and a lot of work trying to build good pathways to help students, make that transition. But the quantitative data that we have so far shows us that happens very infrequently. Probably the number that probably came up the most often is probably about 5% of students would make it from a non-credit program to a credit program. And so that causes us to ask some questions about, why, what's going on, with the students, with the programs, are students not getting the support they need? Are students, goals different than what we think they are? The kind of programs do things differently, or there's just a lot of open questions about, why that is. So that's one big takeaway. The other big takeaway is that there are some modest labor market gains. So there's a lot of question of why does non-credit lead to good outcomes or not? Overall, there are some modest but measurable gains. So there's that finding that kind of comes across. But the big thing to keep in mind is that those gains vary a lot. So there's a huge amount of variation in terms of these outcomes. It varies by local geography, it varies by the program, and it varies by gender. And so I think that's one of the things that's just really important to think about here is just what are some of the underlying reasons for that and how to ensure that any program that you're offering is at that higher level, that leads people to the labor market gains, or if it's not, recognize why that is. Maybe it's in a very, very socially valuable field like early childhood education or some allied health fields, and that's perhaps why it's not leading to higher outcomes. But let's articulate that and make sure students understand that that's what they're entering. But I think the other thing that this really points us to is the local nature of a lot of these programs. And this is, I think, just a theme I keep coming back to is that importance of the connections with the labor market. And so, it's really important for colleges to, be out there trying to assess, what are employers looking for and how do we make sure that the program is recognized, is valued in that local labor market. So how do we make sure that if it's a quality credential or quality program, how do we make sure that it's translated into an outcome of value? And that happens through that sort of labor market engagement, that relationship building, and making sure that there's that they're aligned with the local labor market needs. So I think that's, a couple of really key things that we learn from looking at the outcomes. We certainly still need to know more about, how do programs do this? How do programs push to those higher gains for their students? And we're trying to unpack that further in some of the research that we're doing. But to kind of address that question of, what are students trying to do? What are the experiences of students? We have some new research that we've just launched, and just sharing this with you guys for the first time. I haven't really shared much of this with any audience yet because it's all really new, and I will say it's pretty preliminary. So what I'm sharing with you is very much in the middle of analysis. We are doing more work on this, so it's not final, but I wanted to give you a sort of a peek of what's happening and share some of what we're hearing. So we have been working with a few colleges to do interviews with students. So LaGuardia, Northern Virginia, and Mount San Antonio College have all been working with us to recruit students and understand the sort of to participate in interviews with us, to understand the students' experience in their workforce non-credit programs, what draws the students to those programs, and how do those sort of fit into the students' education and career paths. So in order to do this, we've screen students through a brief survey. We're trying to focus on students who don't have college degrees, so those kind of really pursuing this as their first kind of sub-baccalaureate kind of experience. We've done all the interviews over the phone or via Zoom, and we're still in the midst of doing them. So we're still doing some recruitment. We're intentionally trying to get a broad range of fields so we can understand the wide experience across, business, education, healthcare, IT, trades, vocational ESL. As is typical with a lot of non-credit, the age range is older. Average age is 32. So just some key emerging takeaways. I think one of the big things that came up from talking to students, and I'm going to guess probably I'm speaking things that you all probably know and see in your day-to-day work, but I think it's helpful. I hope it's helpful to document this in research and think about what this means and try and connect it into policy discussions and think about what the implications are. I think one of the things we see with students is this really sort of nonlinear enrollment pathways. And so students are taking lots of different programs, and it's not necessarily clear they see how these all connect. So, one student said, okay, so I have my CNA license, my EKG license, my phlebotomy license, my food handling license. And this license here is a central sterile technician, and I'm going to go for my pharmacy tech. That's about 6 years of school. I could have been a doctor already. So it kind of makes you question, what is the student, they're kind of ongoing, taking all these different programs and sort of trying out different things. And, for some of the other interviews, it seemed, maybe some of the students are sort of in this process of career discovery as they take these programs. Maybe they would have made different choices if they were able to have some advising up front. Many of the students did not have access to advising before they selected their programs. Sometimes, they would enroll in one program. One student was intending to be a radiology tech and enrolled in medical assisting, which, got them closer because they were in the health field, but it still wasn't the place they wanted to be. And so there may be some challenges and problems with, how much students know about what they're getting into and how these programs all connect. So it is, and I think we recognize to put this in the context of higher ed overall. We know like students, do often have a hard time following, linear sort of prescribed pathways and do kind of have to explore and take different paths. But, we see that as much in the non-credit realm, if not more than what we see in some of the credit programs. But what we do see is that students are very interested in, again, sort of validating the students are interested in the shorter term nature of the programs. They feel like it's much more doable. You know, one student said, I wanted to be a doctor, but then in all honesty, that's a lot of schooling. So I dumped it down and decided that my end goal was to become a registered nurse. Okay, so they, you know, another one said, if I can get some quick knowledge and get my foot in the door, I hit the ground running. But to go to school for 2 years or 4 years for a degree, I just never see the end of it. And I get impatient. I've dropped out so many times. So there's that kind of like, you know, just having a goal that's more attainable. Um, you know, and then there's also the affordability. You know, I've been looking for something. I didn't want to take out like a student loan. And was my friend got the decision to be like, oh yeah, this is something I could do because it would be affordable. So there's that piece as well. So these things we hear, you know, the students are bearing out as well. Now, some other things that seem to be motivating some of the students that came up in our interviews were just, you know, some of the challenges that students had in prior schooling experiences. And so, you know, that's one of the theories that has been out around non-credit is that, yeah, you know, it does provide more access for students who may have had a hard time in other kinds of educational experiences. And that does seem to be the case here. We did hear from students, you know, that articulated that they you know, had, you know, various undiagnosed disabilities. So somebody, you know, discussed about their, they weren't diagnosed with ADHD until as an adult. You know, it says they said I, you know, wasn't diagnosed with any of my behavioral health issues until after I'd graduated high school. But, you know, looking back, like, okay, if I had been going to regular therapy or talking or taking medication, I probably wouldn't have had it as bad in school. You know, and so I think that, you know, that reflects the sort of the difficulty that some students have, and then, you know, the appeal of taking something shorter within non-credit. And then, of course, at the same time, we often hear, you know, about the challenges that students have from their family life, you know, in terms of other responsibilities, caregiving, you know, child rearing and things like that. So I think those are additional pieces that, again, probably may not be news stories to all of you, but I think are important takeaways for us to inform the conversation about what's happening in non-credit. So I want to turn just to talk a little bit more finally here about data. So, you know, I've shared with you a little bit about what we're learning about students and what we know about programs. You know, one of the foundational things I'll come back to is just that there's not a lot of data available. We need more to better understand the student experience and inform policy and improve practice. One of the ways that we're trying to work on that at our center here at Rutgers is through our state non-credit data project. And so we've been working with states all over the country to document what they're doing in non-credit and document the data that they have. And, you know, lo and behold, many states do have data. And I know Illinois does as well. Illinois has a very strong data system around non-credit. And you know, we can learn from states that have done this well, and as well as the institutions that are, you know, sending in the, you know, informing the data that go to the state level. What we've done is try to take a look at all of the data that are there, the elements that are collected, and we've developed a non-credit data taxonomy across states that begins to sort of synthesize across the states different elements of non-credit so that we can you know, promote some consistency in language, potentially some consistency in definitions. At least states can kind of see what others have done and use that as a point of departure as they think about developing new systems. And I think that this can also certainly inform the work of institutions as well. You know, these definitions can be informative at many levels. So we do have this data taxonomy. We've also been working to bring together states to share practice through a learning community. So that's something that we continue to do as our project goes forward. For folks only, you know, within states, but we are convening some specialized working groups to help state folks really tackle some particular issues around non-credit, whether it be data collection or aligning with labor market information or thinking about policy and governance. And then we do have a series of other research planned to document state policy and practice around non-credit data and policy, as well as trying to document some strategies for data collection that will be helpful and continue to document what's happening across the state across the states to help update this national taxonomy. I do hope that this, you know, will at some point move more towards working with institutions in terms of helping to bolster and strengthen the data collection effort that happens within the institutions. So this is something I just want to share with you. This is the data taxonomy that we have. This is based on that group of states that I mentioned that we've been working with over the past several years. We have sort of a few different areas of data elements that we've seen across the states that we've worked with. Some of those elements describe and provide more information on the purpose and design of the program, whether it be the field of study or the type of non-credit or other characteristics about the program and program offerings. We also include in there outcomes. Those are very important: academic outcomes, labor market outcomes, and then non-degree credential attainment outcomes. That's another really important piece. And it's tricky to get those data. There are some national efforts that are trying to be built, that are currently underway to be built. There's one effort called Credlins to build a national repository, a data trust, to bring together some data that could help inform these outcomes questions at the national level. That's underway right now, and it's not ready to share data yet. But there's some efforts to think differently here, because part of the challenge here is kind of creating a new infrastructure, a new data infrastructure. Another important element here in the taxonomy are the enrollment and demographics, just again trying to understand who the students are and gather information. And then there's finance and policy. So again, trying to understand better the nature of the programs, how they get funded, and other things in terms of how they're influenced by policy. So this is, sort of an overview of the taxonomy. If you're interested in seeing more about that or thinking more about how that might apply to your work, we have lots of reports and such available on our website. And I'm also going to share a slide later with a lot of other references to reports. And I think we can certainly share these slides around with everybody later after the webinar. So you can look into some of these resources if you're interested. But now that we're getting close to the end of our time together, I wanted to stop again and see if there's any other questions, thoughts, reflections on anything I've shared about, or if there's any of these prompts for discussion might generate some thoughts with you. I'm curious if these data resonate with you, or if you had all the perfect data that you would want to talk about. What do you wish you could use that for in terms of helping people understand the work in non-credit? Any thoughts, questions, reflections?
So Michelle, we did have a question in the chat. What was the email address to reach out to for information on the working group?
Okay. Yeah, well, that'll be in the slides. We can share it later. That's for Paula Nissen. We are keeping the working groups for state folks who are employed at a state entity. Although the other thing I should mention is that's the working groups. We do have a quarterly learning community meeting where we share out all the lessons from this project in terms of the data and what we're learning across states, and that's open to anybody. So that's also available on our state non-credit data project. And we have our next learning community meeting coming up on June 9th, on Monday, June 9th. So, but yeah, this is a list of references. And yes, I saw the question about, we can definitely share out these slides after the presentation. I'll be happy to, I'll email these over so you can share them with everybody.
And then we did have a question about how individuals would sign up for the learning community.
The learning community. Yes, that I can also put that specifically in the follow-up. I mean, that is on, let me see, on our website here. To learn more about the data project, you can go to that website, and then there will be like a sign up here tab. But I can also put that in our follow-up as well, just to help people get right to that spot.
Okay, beautiful. And then, yeah, once Michelle shares all of that information with me, I will need to edit and get this recording rendered. And then I will share, once that's complete, I'll share that with Levon and Alex, and we can make sure that not only the participants on the call today get the information, but also those who were not able to join this afternoon.
That's great, Brittany. And thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to be part of this work. I think what you all are doing here in Illinois is just really exciting and fantastic work. And I'm just so curious to learn from what you do. So I hope to continue to stay engaged with your work here.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions for Michelle, thank you so much for presenting for us again. I'm sure you'll hear from us down the road sometime at some point again, now that we know you're willing to share and participate. And thank you all for attending. Like I said, we'll get information collected, recordings edited, and make sure all of this information is shared out with you as well. So thank you all so much for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.